Now we're looking at the question in the 19th century, really the argument between the emergence of early reform and those who were more traditional regarding the question of prayer in the local language. So the temple in Hamburg that was being built, the first Reformed temple in 1820, wanted to have prayer in German. And we had seen the Mishnah that said actually that you could pray in any language. So now there's a Rambam I just wanted to look at also. The Rambam says, this is in the Rambam's Mishnah Torah's Book of Jewish Law. Since the Jewish people, from when the Jewish people were exiled by Nebuchadnezzar, the wicked one, Nisarvu Biprasviavan, they were integrated into Persia and Greece and into other nations. They had children in other lands. And those children who were born in other lands, in Persia and Greece, after the exile of the first temple, so their languages were mixed up. They weren't speaking Hebrew, they were speaking the local language. And there was a mixture of languages. And people were not able to speak because they were speaking more than one language, or because they had adopted a new language, they weren't really able to articulate their prayer well. They were not as poetic as they had been when they were only speaking Hebrew. And they didn't know how to speak Hebrew, and they spoke every other language. It says in the book of Nehemiah, that's after the end of the first exile, near 583, that they were speaking a different language. So they weren't able to be as eloquent in composing prayers, right? Because remember, prayer was not fixed during the time of the first temple. Prayer during the time of the first temple was just spontaneous personal prayer. And fixed prayer was the sacrifices. Fixed service of God was the sacrifices. But the problem is that people were not doing well with composing their own prayers because of the exile. So either to ask for their own needs or to praise God. It says, when they tried to do it in Hebrew, they didn't do it well. And it mixed in other languages. So when Ezra saw that the Jewish people, when they were coming back from the first exile, saw that the Jewish people were not eloquent in composing their own personal prayers, they created the Amidah, the 18 blessings. First three are praise to God, the middle ones are asking for what one needs, and the last three are always thanking God. And why did they do that? Why did they fix prayer? Why did they create the Amidah? So that prayer would be eloquent in the mouth of everybody. They would have more eloquent prayer like it was in earlier times. And so therefore, everybody would have a standardized prayer, and it would be eloquent and well composed and meaningful. So that's interesting, right? That's sort of different than what we've been reading, right? Because before this, we were reading in the Shulchan Aruch and in the Gemara that you could pray in any language. And if you understand another language, you certainly could pray in that language, and maybe it's even better, right? According to the Magen Avram, one of the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, he had said that it's actually better to pray in a language that you understand rather than to pray in Hebrew. Now, the Mishnah Berurah had said the opposite. Mishnah Berurah is much later, as we mentioned in the 20th century, late 19th century. He had said, no, Hebrew's better. But we were theorizing that it's probably also a response to the Reform movement, which wanted to pray in German. But you see in the Rambam here, this other side of the coin, which is that the prayers were fixed in Hebrew, and they were fixed because people were not good at creating their own prayer. Now, you could argue that praying in translation is not composing your own prayer. It's really just a translation of the Amidah. You could argue that. Okay, so let's go back to our book. So we're looking at the books that were written back and forth during this argument in 1820 between the Reform and the more traditional. Basically between, and this book is written by a rabbi named Breslau, who's sort of writing for, quote, Reformation. He's writing to have prayer in the vernacular. And the Hamburg Bezdin that was writing very much against it, right? So he quotes the Shulchan Aruch and the Magen Avraham that we saw. And then he quotes the Hamburg Bezdin's position, and he says theirs is not a halachic position. So let's look, right? He quotes actually quotes 8 sources that he thinks are saying that you have to pray in Hebrew as a community, but that he thinks is actually not the halacha. And the first one is the Chassam Sofer, the Rabbi of Pressburg. Now, the Chassam Sofer was very famous for going against reform very strongly. So this is the Chassam Sofer's letter. We looked at the beginning of it yesterday. And here's a part where he talks about prayer in another language. So he says, right, and what we want to sort of judge is how are they looking at it? How are their arguments different? This is basically one argument against another, right? The Rabbi Breslau, who's fighting to allow the First Reformed Temple, which remember had separate seating, and it wasn't a Reformation yet, that the First Reformed Temple should have prayer in German. He seems to argue it well, right? He's basically just quoting the Talmud and Shulchan Aruch, which says you can pray in any language. And in fact, the Talmud had said that it's better that an individual should not pray in another language, should only pray in Hebrew, because it's harder to have your prayers accepted as an individual. But a community does not necessarily, it seemed like the Gemara was saying, and the Shulchan Aruch was quoting it as, the Gemara does not, a community does not need to pray in Hebrew, it could pray in another language. So that's what he was quoting. So what's the Chassam Sofer's response to that? So he says, V'alma tfilatam b'tzibor b'lashon she'eino lashon hakodesh. This Hamburg Temple in 1820 wants to have prayer which is not in Hebrew. Ze'i efshar b'shem ofen. That's impossible. The Imgam Mishnah Arukahi, he says, now on the other hand, I know that in the Gemara there's a Mishnah that says Eilen Emor b'chalashon. These could be said in any language, and prayer, tefillah, the Amidah, is included in that Mishnah. So, right, the Chassam Sofer is saying, what do I do with the Mishnah? The Mishnah says you can fulfill your mitzvah in any language. The Chassam Sofer argues that that's only an individual, and it's only once in a while. He says, but to fix it in another language and to have a cantor go up there and pray in another language, he says that's definitely forbidden. Now, I don't know. I didn't see that in the Gemara or in the Shulchan Aruch. So why is that? So here's his argument, right? The Hamburg Bezdin, people writing for that side, are going to have to come up with very different kinds of arguments, because they're going against, because the truth is that the pshat, the plain meaning of the text of the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch is that you could pray in another language. Certainly a community could pray in another language, right? I mean, we have a sense that that's just totally off, right? But is that because it is totally off, or is that because we live in the post the Reform movement and we see what's, where it went? So he says, and remember, he's writing right at the beginning. He says, Zev Vadai Aser. Why? De'im Kain, here's his argument. Lo Kain hayu anshe Knesset Hagdol metakmin tefillah b'lashon hakodesh tzachonaki. He says, as we just saw in the Rambam, the anshe Knesset Hagdol, men of the Great Assembly, fixed prayer, the Amidah, in Hebrew. And we just saw in the Rambam that half the people that came back from the exile, they spoke Persian. So when the men of the Great Assembly made prayer fixed, why didn't they fix it in the language people spoke? Right? The people didn't speak Hebrew after 70 years in exile. They spoke Persian. Fix it in Persian. That would have been a better language for the people. The Hativ Barambam Parakal, he quotes that Rambam that we just saw. With the Ezra in the book of Ezra, it says, Vayikru b'sefer Tarat Elokim mefurash v'shum seichel. Right? They read the Torah and people didn't understand it. V'amar Chazal, the Parakei de Megillah, Zeu HaTargum. So they had to translate the Torah as they read it, right? And that, of course, is the Targum translation of Onkelos into Aramaic. In fact, Yemenite Jews still do that. Every time they read a verse in the Torah in Shul, it's translated right away by a Meturgaman, by a translator. So you see that people did not understand Hebrew. That's why they had to have a translator. My time. So therefore, he says, why didn't, when the men of the Great Assembly fixed the Amidah, why didn't they do it in another language? Why in Hebrew? People didn't understand Hebrew. So he says, Ella, al korchach anshe knesset gadol metakmit tefillah shehay b'ham neviim. So he says it must be that they did it in Hebrew because really it has older roots, prophetic roots. Kasher kosav gamaram, as the Rambam also writes, sheyada sheyadu me Hashem. So he's saying there's something deeper, something more mystical about praying in Hebrew. You can't just replace the sacrifices with any prayer you want. Then came right? The temple was very fixed. It was a fixed kind of service. You can't substitute for those sacrifices just with any kind of prayer you want or in any language you want. They fixed the Amidah in a way that, I think he's saying a mystical thing, that on a deeper level would take the place of the sacrifices, that which was lacking spiritually from the sacrifices. Right? In other words, he's appealing to mysticism. And they understood the significance of every letter and every word. The Efshar, right? This is a little bit like the Hasidic approach to prayer, which is that every word is mystical, and the number of words and the structure of the words, even the letters. The Efshar and it could never have been fixed, he says, in another language, because it's not about the content. It is about the content, but it's about something much deeper. Only if we say it as the men of the Great Assembly fixed it, even though we have no idea what they meant by it, what their deeper intent was. Our prayer will work. But if we want to pray in another language, who says it's going to work? We don't understand the mystical depths of it. And if the problem is that people don't understand Hebrew, so let them learn the translation of it. You do that, he says, in front of a king who's not God, in front of a regular king. You don't speak your own language in front of, you go to visit a different king, you're going to speak his language. It's not nice to speak to the king of all kings in your language. Speak in God's language, which is Hebrew. That's his argument, right? So he's right and he's wrong, right? Now that's halachically sort of grasping at straws. That's what it feels like, right? Because really, it's permitted to pray in another language. But of course, what he's looking at is the big picture, I think, right? He's saying this is anathema, the idea that you're going to have a synagogue after thousands of years of Jews praying in Hebrew. All of a sudden, you're going to have a synagogue in 1820 that's going to start praying. The Chazan's going to go up there and pray in German, right? In other words, that he understands that it has to be that the Chassam Sofer is speaking to something much bigger. He understands something much more is at stake here. This is not, because what he's making is not really a halakhic argument. What he's really doing is kind of weaving it, in the sky. It's God's language. It's the letters are exactly what they need to be. I mean, that's not what the Gemara had said. It's not what the Shulchan Aruch said. Right, you see it in the Mishnah Berurah a little bit more, but that's already the practically the 20th century. Okay, let's see another source. So that's the first source that he quotes, that Rabbi Breslau quotes, that he's standing up against. Second source is this one. And this is the rabbi of Ravitch, Aaron Yeshua. And he writes this in a letter to Bezdin of Hamburg. Let's take a look. It says, greetings, and sort of flowery greetings. He says, there are these men who have risen up to put a hand against our prayer book. that has been passed to us from our ancestors, from the early days. Yitodota b'harei kodesh. The source of our prayers is in the netherworlds. And these prayers are what everybody prays. Hemashiklu b'felet mishkal hakodesh et divreihem. And they have balanced very carefully with sanctity their words, using their spiritual intellect. And if you're not, Ezra, and if you're not the Anshe Knesset Gadol, the men of the Great Assembly, and you're not a great scholar, you can't understand. Only they, the men of the Great Assembly, were able to choose the right words, which could pierce through to the holiness of the divine. And if you're going to try and compose in another language, you're going to try and translate into another language, you're not going to have the same intent that our rabbis had. Within the words of Hebrew prayer that the rabbis chose are different intents. And not every person can just understand the deep intents of prayer. So he says, but it's true that you're not going to understand everything. So just understand the basics of prayer, even though you're praying in Hebrew. If you pray in Hebrew, even though you just understand the basics, and you direct your heart toward God, that will be enough. So who are these people that want to lift themselves up to claim that which is holy, to change something, to change the language of our prayers? Our language of prayer is in the siddur, or to pray in a different language, or to play an instrument in the synagogue. That was part of the issue, of course, was the organ. That was only in the temple. Jews haven't done this for thousands of years. And that's his argument. So it's right. What are these arguments that that they're making? They're not illegitimate arguments. I'm not saying that, but they're not in the details of the halacha, because the details of the halacha are you can pray in another language, right? They appeal to mysticism. They appeal to tradition. They appeal to sort of the ego, or the audacity of the reform to make a change like this, and that's all important and legitimate. Ultimately, I don't know if it really worked. I don't think it stemmed the tide of reform. It didn't. And I'm not sure. What would history have been had the Chassam Sofer, who was the primary against reform, if he had said, okay, yeah, it's good you have separate seating, it's good that you're all coming to pray in German, very nice, use an organ, right? Find halachic grounds for that. Would that have been better or worse? I don't know. Obviously we're looking at 200 years of history, but it's interesting that what their arguments back are. In a certain way they're talking against there.
Well, I'm assuming that they said things in Aramaic like we say, right? They said
Kaddish.
They said Rich Shmei Demari Alma. They said Kaddish.
Why aren't those in Hebrew?
No, but I'm assuming they said those things in Aramaic.
The reform.
No, even the mainstream, the Orthodox. So they would have to use an argument of tradition or of inspiration from the prophets, because even when they're praying, there are a few things which are not Hebrew.
There are a few things in Aramaic. Yeah, basically, tefillah means the Amidah. I think. That's okay. Really what it means. Now, I don't know. If they had said to the reform, do the Amidah in Hebrew, everything else you can do in German. I don't know, maybe that would have been fine with everybody. I don't think it would have. I mean, I think they would have seen that as a tremendous slippery slope. But I think they're also arguing from tradition, and they would probably say the rabbis instituted the Kaddish in Aramaic, or whatever. There's some discussion, but, based on this whole thing of like angels don't understand Aramaic. There's some discussion of why Kaddish. Maybe that's why you need a name for Kaddish. Yeah, that's a good question, though. I mean, why isn't there an argument back of like, no, some prayers are not in Hebrew? Yeah, that's a good question. We'll do some more of this. It's interesting. Have a good Shabbos, everybody.
So,
Welcome,
thank you.
Madison.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.